And so please join me in welcoming David M. Kennedy.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks to Humanities Texas, Mike Gillette in particular, for organizing these and this and many similar events that I've had the privilege of participating in years past. And I want to say a special shout out to my old pal George Forgy for getting me here safely from the airport today, a non-trivial task that he executed with grace and dignity. So thank you very much, George. So I often tell my students at Stanford that when they inquire about studying American history, that if they want to be selective and focused, there are three great moments in the history of our nation that if they're understood in some depth, if you understand them in some depth, you've gone a long way toward understanding the whole American story. And one is the moment of the Revolution and Confederation. The second is the moment of Civil War and Reconstruction. And the third is the back-to-back episodes of the Great Depression and World War II. In each of those moments in American history, it seems to me, the nature of the country, the nature of the whole American experiment before and after each of those events was markedly different. And each of them can be understood as truly transformative. So the one we're focusing on here at this workshop is, of course, the period of the Great Depression and World War II. And if we're going to make the argument that this was a transformative moment in American history, as I believe it was, we need to know a little something about what the country looked like before the Great Depression came over the horizon in 1929. So that's my task for this evening, is to give you some benchmark baseline data about some important aspects, some, I think, salient aspects of American society in the 1920s, which was my assignment to talk about the 20s, by way of laying down a baseline by which we can measure the degree of transformation that's about to come over the horizon with the arrival of the Great Depression and then World War II. Now, in my classroom, I'm going to try to share with you some of my own classroom experiences and how I've, over many years, tried to present this material in a way that gets through to students. And I want to begin by laying down a premise, and that is I think it's important to meet the students where they are to the extent possible. And in this case, that means drawing some comparisons between then and now. Clearly, the moment in time they know best is their own. They don't have a lot of data about what happened before the date of their birth, but they supposedly, we hope, at least have if they're sentient beings, they know something about the world they're now living in. And if we can draw some comparisons between now and another time, we can help them understand both the present and the past. So I sometimes begin with a line from what was once upon a time a famous novel by a long-forgotten novelist by the name of L.P. Hartley. The novel is The Go-Between. It was published in 1953, later became a film, and it begins with the following observation. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And if you can get students to focus on that, to regard the past not just as the prologue to the present, but a place where things were done differently, and therefore they can begin to appreciate the dynamics of change that really deposit each of us in successive generations in different places from where our forebears were. So that's my task here tonight, is to describe the foreign country that was the United States in the early 20th century, especially in the 1920s. Now, I want to say at the outset, I was very pleased to see that in your program for this event, there are several excerpts from a document called Recent Social Trends. And the existence of that is a two-volume work, Recent Social Trends, published in 1933. The existence of that document, if nothing else, gives us no excuse for not understanding the 1920s in depth, because those two volumes are absolutely fabulously rich in descriptive and empirical data about all different aspects of American life in the pre-Depression decade. The book itself, Recent Social Trends, has an interesting publication history. It was commissioned by Herbert Hoover. One of the very first things he did on assuming the presidency in 1929 was to call together a group of social scientists and to commission them to study and research and write for him an extensive map, you might say, of various aspects of American society at that moment in time. And when he called them together for their initial meeting at the White House, he told them, and I'm quoting now, that he wanted them to provide a basis for the formulation of large national policies looking to the next phase in the nation's development. Now, if nothing else, and I'll return to this tomorrow, that little bit of prose from Herbert Hoover reminds us of something we should know, that Herbert Hoover is unfairly characterized as a hopelessly moss-backed conservative president. He was, in fact, the legatee of the progressive tradition. He cast his first presidential ballot for Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, served in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet, and again, as we'll see tomorrow, he thought that with his presidency, it was time to resume the work of the progressive movement that, in his view, had ground to a halt with the coming of World War I some 14 or 15 years earlier. So Herbert Hoover, before the Depression ever happened, had a very well-developed sense that he, in the decade of the 1920s, he and his fellow citizens were living through a moment of great and potentially transformative changes. That this was a hinge moment in history where new technologies, new values, new ways of life, new engagement with the world, all kinds of things were happening that made it incumbent upon him as a new president to understand them deeply in rich empirical detail and to make national policy on the basis of good information. Now, for those of you who might have first learned about the 1920s, looking around this room, I think maybe it's not many of you, but maybe a few, from Frederick Lewis Allen's famous book, Only Yesterday. How many of you read that book? Oh, only a few of the more senior members of our delegation here know that book. But for 2 or more generations, most students of American history who learned anything about the 1920s either learned it directly from Frederick Lewis Allen's book, Only Yesterday, or learned it as secondhand from a teacher who'd read it. And in that volume, you get a description of the 1920s as a time, a moment in American history that was inhabited by nothing other than filthy, rich, and frivolous, greedy, slap-happy people who were high on bathtub gin and did nothing but dance to jazz and fritter away some of the best moments of their lives. Significantly, in that book, it's a hugely distorted view of what the 1920s were all about. And significantly, just to give you 2 markers, and I'll come back to this, you will search from beginning to the end of that book to hear any mention of African Americans, or as Allen would have said, Negroes in his day, blacks. And you will find farmers described only in a couple of pages under the rubric of the discussion of the Scopes, so-called Scopes monkey trial in the mid-1920s. So 2 huge components of American society essentially get no mention whatsoever in that book. So the reality of life in the 1920s is actually much richer than Frederick Lewis Allen ever understood or encouraged his readers to understand, and I think it's a lot more interesting than his account gave us. So let's start with some just absolutely baseline, basic comparisons between then and now. You'll see on the screen over here, this is just to get a sense of scale, that we are, as of the last census, from 310 million people. It's higher still today. We'll get an official read in the next census just in a couple of years. But you can see at a glance that we are just, rough numbers, about 2.5 times more people in this society than we were on the eve of the Great Depression. These data are from the census, of course, of 1930. We're also an older people. Our median age was a lot younger in the 1920s than it is today. And you can see the population age distribution here. 1930, again, 29% of the population under 15 years of age. Recently, in the last decade or so, only 20% or so. So you go back here, median age again, pushing on towards 40. We're not quite in the situation of Japan. Japan is about to teach all the world a lesson because within a few years, if something doesn't change, the median age in Japan will be 50. And we have no experience or knowledge of a society on that scale, at least, that is that old, where people will not have many children and grandparents will not know grandchildren and so on. They'll be an old people. We're not quite there, but we're headed in that direction. Life expectancy at birth, again, you can see we live longer. That's part of the reason we're an older society, obviously. And you'll notice something else here, and I'll come back to this point later, that there was then and is now a significant gap between white and non-white longevity. Although the gap has narrowed somewhat, it's still a reality. It was much greater in 1900 and 1930 than it is as recently as 1997 when these data were gathered. Now, here's an important point that my students, at least, resonate to pretty quickly. This is one that's quite accessible to them. And it has to do with the percentage of women in the workforce. And there's a background story here that I'll just touch on briefly. If you look at the census data from 1930, again, the census data gathering moment is closest to the beginning of our story, you'll see that women are a minority in the population. They're about 48 or 49%. And students say, well, what's the first census that shows a majority of women in the American population? The answer is, I'm sure everybody in this room knows, but just to remind you, it's 1950. So you start asking, well, why is it that there was a majority of men in the population from the 1800 first census in 1790 all the way through 1950? Why might that be? Well, if you scratch a little bit, the students will eventually come up with the answer. It has to do with immigration. Because the immigrant stream over the 19th and early 20th century was predominantly male, and that kept the sex ratio, or gender ratio, I suppose we'd say today, in majority male territory until 1950, and that's a function of the essential closing down of immigration around the time of World War I in the early 1920s. So there are fewer women in the population than men until well after World War II. But even more significantly, I think, and this here we are really touching on something fundamental to just the parameters of American life, that there are relatively few women in the workforce. 24% of 25% essentially of women were in the workforce in 1930. 2008, about 65%. It's roughly the same today. It's come down just a little bit. And if you're asking about married women, there were very few married women in the workforce. And if you ask about married women with children, there were almost none in the workforce. And today, a majority of mothers of children under the age of 5 are in the wage labor workforce, a majority. So we're in the presence here, just between these two data points, we're in the presence of some major shifts in the nature of work, the nature of employment, the nature of wage earning, the role of the family, the role of women, and again, if you can get students just to concentrate on just the data that are encoded right there in that simple image, you can get them to understand that we live in an era when we've had revolutions in sexual roles, in the implications of aging, and the structure and function of families. And here again, here are the data just a little more refined. Percentage of married women in the workforce, 1930, 12%. 2007 to 62%, and I don't know if I've got, no, I don't have the data about women with children, but they're even more dramatic than this. The average woman worker in the 1920s went to work as a young single woman, got married eventually, most women did, and at that point never worked again and didn't intend to work again. World War II changes that only very, very slightly as it happens. But the real changes in women's employment and wage labor in relation to the workforce all come in the post-World War II period. And of course, our students, indeed us, we ourselves, are part of that revolution. But it wasn't happening in the 1920s nor even the 1930s. All right, let's turn to another demographic feature of our society in the early 20th century. And again, this tells a pretty dramatic story. Where's our beginning point here? 1920, you see there's a slight spike in immigration just after World War I, and then of course there's legislation that in 1924 especially, that seriously dampens the immigrant stream, reduces it to about 10 or 15% of its pre-war level, so that this, it doesn't show on this chart, but by the time you get to the census of 1970, only about 5% of Americans are foreign-born. Today it's about 13%. But the period from the 1920s to well into the 1960s is a period of least immigration in almost all of American history. And the great immigrant communities that had arrived at the turn of the century, that is, turn of the 19th to the 20th century, were beginning to mature by the 1920s, and their political identities were not very well fixed. They were available for recruitment by either the Republican or the Democratic Party. And though it's not part of my subject here this evening, I'll just tell you in advance that one of the great demographic/political goals and achievements of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal was to incorporate those immigrant communities to cultivate their loyalty to the Democratic Party. I'll give you one quick index of that, even though I'm getting ahead of my story. In the 12 years of Republican presidencies in the 1920s, that's Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, there were approximately 250, that's a round number, it's an approximation, vacancies on the federal bench, the federal judiciary. And those 3 Republican presidents appointed exactly 8 Roman Catholics to the federal bench throughout the entire decade of the 1920s. Franklin Roosevelt, in his first 2 terms, his 8 years, not 12, appointed well over 50 Roman Catholics to the federal bench. A clear indication of a different orientation in terms of political recruitment and attaching loyalties of immigrant communities to one party and not the other. Here again, in comparison to the present, you can get, incidentally, all these slides are going to be available to you. You're welcome to use them. You can probably get even better, more up-to-date data if you roam around on the internet a little bit. But again, you can see that not only has the immigration picture changed over the course of the 20th century, but most dramatically, the source of immigrants has changed. Again, we all know this. We live in this moment. But for students to understand that immigration from the Americas, that's looked down here in the early 20th century, is virtually none. I mean, it's very, very nominal. And of course, from Asia is almost invisible until we get well into the tail end of the 20th century. Most immigrants are from Europe. And of course, at that moment, the early 20th century, the immigrant stream is dominated by immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who were culturally, religiously, linguistically, and so on, quite different from the immigrant stream that had come earlier. And again, here's the data I was just mentioning a moment ago. By the time we get to 1970, the immigrant or foreign-born population of the United States is at an historic low point, and much of the nostalgia that many people of a certain generation have for a more culturally homogeneous country stems from the fact that they grew up in that post-World War II moment when there were relatively few immigrants in the country, and we had a degree of cultural homogeneity that we didn't have before and we haven't had since. Some people find that disturbing. Some people find it politically mobilizable, and you know what I'm talking about. The racial composition of the American population. Again, this is another interesting data point, it seems to me, that whites remain a majority, of course, from 1930 into well into the beginning years of the 21st century. But virtually the only racial minority that's measurable in any significant way are African Americans, who are roughly 10% of the population in 1930. They're a greater percentage of the population today, but they're no longer the biggest ethnic or racial minority. That's Hispanics, who are now something in the range of 14 or 15% of the population. Okay, now this to me is particularly interesting, when the urban percentage of the population. For reasons that have always eluded me, almost any even casual student of American history seems to have registered and planted in their memory cells the fact that the first census to show a majority urban population was 1920. And that's true. The way the Census Bureau measures and defines urban and rural, the first census to show us a majority urban people is 1920. But as you can see here, even as late as 1930, that's only barely true. That still nearly half the population still lived in the countryside. Today, it's the rural percentage of the population is in the 20% range, as you can see here, as of 2000. But we were still, if not no longer a majority rural country as of 1920. We hadn't changed that much as the Great Depression comes by 1930. We're still a heavily rural people. This is something that shows the African American population, the distribution of the African American population. I'm going to show you 3 images here. This is 1890, and again you can see heavy concentration in the traditional states of the former Confederacy. Here's 1930. It really hasn't changed that much as of 1930. Something like 75% of all African Americans in 1930 still lived in the states of the old Confederacy, and here it is in 2000. And though the black population has now distributed itself over much of the country, it is still heavily concentrated in the states of the former Confederacy. And you might ask why that that population is so persistently, stubbornly located in the South in an era, especially in the early 20th century, when millions of immigrants per year were coming from elsewhere. If it was northern employment opportunity that was drawing immigrants from Europe into the country, why wasn't it equally powerfully drawing African Americans out of the South? It did to some degree, but not in a way that changes these distributional maps. I just put that to you as a question. All right. We know that a great African American migration gets kicked off. There's a kind of a rehearsal in the World War I era, and then a great one that really kicks off with World War II, so that blacks do move out of the South and distribute themselves around the country. But there's another, and that's a great population shift, a great demographic shift, has all kinds of implications. But there's another one that takes place just as our era begins to get going, that is the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And it's illustrated in this schematic map here, which looks kind of boring maybe at first glance, but actually tells quite a story. So we're one of the very few countries in the world, maybe the only country in the world, that mandates a decennial census in its constitution. Lots of countries take censuses of themselves, but we are constitutionally obliged to do it every 10 years. Why? We all know the answer, because the founders wanted to preserve the sacred principle of proportional representation in the people's house, the House of Representatives, the lower chamber, and by implication, preserve that kind of popular or proportional representation in the Electoral College. So we do it every 10 years, and one byproduct of that constitutional mandate is that we have some really great data about ourselves, going back to the late 18th century. And one of the things that the census people do with the data is every 10 years they calculate something called the population center of gravity. And the methodology is kind of complicated and wonky, but I'll give you the kind of the non-engineer's version of it. If you imagine a map of the United States as a weightless plane, and then you distribute hypothetical weights on it according to where people live, where that map will balance on a needle point is the population center of gravity. So here you see all those little red triangles that you see there, beginning up here, the head of the Chesapeake in 1790, represent center of population by decade. And if you just study this map for even a few seconds, you'll see something. Between 1790 and 1880, the intervals between the little triangles tell us just how rapidly population is spreading westward. So that the 1790 to 1880, essentially, this is the classic westward movement that students study in grade school and high school, and around which all kinds of mythology has been built. It's the great phenomenon that Frederick Jackson Turner wrote about in that notorious essay in the 1890s. But then you'll notice something else. Between 1880 and roughly 1940, the westward movement slows down markedly to the point where there's no space between these little triangles here when you get into the mid-decades or early decades of the 20th century. And then what happens? We get a second westward movement here. So the center of population gravity is now in Plato, Missouri. Nobody had ever heard of Plato, Missouri until the center of population gravity was calculated to be there. It has no other claim on our attention. But something happens in this period here, just before and after 1940, when we reinvigorate the westward movement, and as you can see, obviously, it now moves not just east-west, but southwesterly. What's going on there? Well, a lot of things that have their roots in the period we're talking about, especially, amongst all the things we're talking about, especially federal government investment in hydrology infrastructure in the arid West. I'm talking about Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, Bonneville Dam, Shasta Dam, Fort Peck Dam, on and on and on. Every major system in the West has been dammed and tamed in the early to mid-20th century, and that's what made possible the populating of the West in a degree that simply wasn't possible because of mainly the factor of aridity until this period that you will be studying. And why does it dip southward here, this population center of gravity? Partly because of the growth of the South, the historic South, or the Sun Belt, as the South and West are now called together. And also, yet another factor is that now we're looking not just at an east-west movement here, but we're also looking, it's implicit in this, but if you think about it, you'll get it, we're looking at a south to north movement. as migration came from Central America, and especially from Mexico, toward the end of the century, so that populated especially the American Southwest, so that we get, again, a major demographic shift which has its roots in our region. And again, if you needed further proof of that, I think this does it for you. In 1900, 10 largest American cities. There's only one Western city on the list. It's San Francisco at number 9. By 1930, there's still only one Western city, but this time it's Los Angeles. By the time you get 2007 or 2018, it wouldn't look much different. I believe it's 7 of the 10 largest cities in the United States are in the West, including some right here, of course, in Texas. So let's go back to agriculture and the rural sector. Among the things that, again, the technological innovations that drive social and economic change was quite simply the internal combustion engine. And not only in its role of promoting automobiles like the famous Tin Lizzie, Henry Ford, Model T, Model A, but also, as this thing tells us very clearly, mechanizing agriculture. American farmers, especially as international or global commodities markets were badly disrupted by World War I, American farmers started planting more acreage to crops and serviced that acreage by investing heavily, going into debt to buy machines like this one, internal combustion engine fired agricultural equipment. So there was a significant debt load that American farmers took on in the World War I period. And when commodity markets international commodity markets restabilized after the war, and European, especially Russian and Ukrainian and Indian and Egyptian and Argentinian production comes back online, in grain markets in particular, the price of all kinds of commodities plummeted, and farmers who had gone into debt to bring more acreage under cultivation and to buy machinery to do it fell into a deep depression. And the American countryside had been in a depressed state since approximately 1921 or 1922. So that when the so-called Great Depression, capital G, capital D, arrives in 1929 and 1930, this is old news in the countryside because commodity prices have been so devastated, combined with the accession of debt during World War I, that the whole agricultural sector was in a terrible condition. So what's the first thing that Herbert Hoover does when he becomes president of the United States in 1929? He calls Congress into special session, an extraordinary political moment, to pass a bill to aid the agricultural sector. What's among the very first things that Franklin Roosevelt does when he comes to office in 1933? He has Congress pass the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is also aimed at bailing out the agricultural sector. So in the minds of people in that era, though we were a majority urban country, all right, as of the census of 1920, the sickest sector in their perception, both Hoover and Roosevelt, was agriculture, was the countryside, and federal aid was going to be necessary to do it. And again, this tells us an interesting story here about just how much of the workforce was in agriculture. Here we are in the 1920s, and more than 20% of the workforce was in agriculture. There's a steady long-term secular trend, to be sure, from the beginning of the century and even earlier. And this only takes us to 1960, when 7 or 8% of the workforce is in agriculture. But get this, in the 1920s, 1 out of every 5 workers was in the agricultural sector. 20% of all employees, all workers in the country. Today, it's less than 2%. So 1 out of 5 in the 1920s was in agriculture. 1 out of 50 today is in the agricultural sector. I'm going to bore you for a moment, maybe, with some California data. California is the most productive agricultural state, believe it or not. There's more agricultural product in California than anywhere else, and in some crop categories, California outpaces everybody, fruits, vegetables, nuts, so on. And it's a big deal in California, but California is such a rich state in so many other ways that all the billions of dollars of agricultural product that are produced in California amount to 2% of California's GDP. So our whole economic profile nationally, including in California, of course, has shifted so drastically that even though we produce more agricultural product now than we did a generation or two or three ago, agriculture as a share of GDP, as a claim on the workforce and other resources, has declined drastically. But that was not true in the era we're looking at. In the 1920s, 20% of the workforce is still in agriculture. It is the most distressed sector, and therefore it makes perfectly logical sense that both Hoover, before the Great Depression hit, calls a special session of Congress to deal with the distressed agricultural sector, and Franklin Roosevelt does the same. And this is just to give you some idea of what life in rural America looked like at that time. Recent Social Trends, the book I mentioned at the outset and that is excerpted in your program, tells us that as of 1930, only 10% of homes in rural America had indoor plumbing. 10. My own father grew up in a house in upstate New York that had no indoor plumbing in the early 20th century, and only 8% of rural homes had electricity as of 1930. So life in rural America was, the terms of life were entirely different from the terms of life in urban America. And this had been an issue, of course, going back a generation or two. What was the populist protest of the 19th century all about? It was about the perception that the terms of life were changing for countryside and city, and something needed to be done about it. Why did Theodore Roosevelt commission the Country Life Commission report in 1908, 1909? It was an effort, again, like Hoover and Recent Social Trends, to get reliable data. But the perception that there were diverging ways of life between countryside and city was, by the time of the 1920s and 30s, well established. But it remained for anybody to do anything about it. So this is what life in rural America was like for a lot of people well into the 1930s. Dorothea Lange, of course, famous photographer. This is people on the road from Oklahoma or Arkansas headed west. Now, I want to indulge myself in a little bit of a personal story and offer myself to you as a historical specimen. You could tell, okay? And the story has to do with this place here. It's called Trinity. You can Google it, look it up to this day. It's an abandoned mining camp in the North Cascade Mountains in Washington State. Who's from Seattle, I heard? Okay. You know where Leavenworth is, Lake Wenatchee? It's a little bit north of there. Maybe it's the headwaters of the Chihuahua River. It's where the Chihuahua River and Phelps Creek meet. You ever been there? Maybe? I've been to that area. All right. Well, why do I bring this up? I'll tell you in a minute. This is what it looks like in the wintertime. That's a building that's nearly buried in the snow. It gets 40, 50 feet of snow a year easily. It's not at a high elevation, so the snow is actually quite heavy and water-packed, and the snow, if it's not removed, will crush buildings. And since the place it's been a ghost town for years, many of the buildings have collapsed, as a matter of fact. This is what it looked like when it was running in the 1920s, just being built. So this photograph probably dates from about 1928 or 1929. And there's the mess hall. You can tell by the vintage automobiles there out in front, roughly when this photograph was taken. And I'm sure you're wondering what the devil are you seeing all this for? Well, here's the reason. That's my mother and father, who lived and worked in that camp for a while. Here's the story. My father came out west from near Buffalo, New York after World War I. I tell you this by way of encouraging your students to think of themselves as living in history. It's like that famous character in the Moliere play, who discovers one day that he's been speaking prose all his life. And the students are encouraged to think, well, hey, we're living in history all the time, and maybe it behooves us to know something about the historical context that we're plugged down in, accident of our birth. So I can tell my family story here, at least in part, as a tale that illustrates a much larger historical story about the 1920s and about the Great Depression and what came thereafter. So my father worked in a factory in Buffalo, New York during World War I. He was a young man. He was born in 1896. And he saved his money, lived at home. He was the first male in his family to be allowed to go to school beyond the 8th grade. His two older brothers were apprenticed at age 13. That was standard practice. But because he was the youngest, the family by that time had a little more means. They allowed him to finish high school. That was all the education he ever had. And incidentally, if you want to mark this historically, the average doughboy recruit in World War I had a little less than a 6th grade education. So we were not a terribly well-educated people as the 20th century opened. It's only in the 1930s that eventually we get to the point where the typical 15 to 20-year-old cohort has some high school education. But that wasn't true for much of the earlier part of the century. So my father comes west in about 1923 or 4. He works in a mine or mining camps in Butte, Montana. He meets a buddy who tells him about a new copper mine venture that's getting started in Washington State. They pack up and they move a little further west, and my father goes to work for what's called the Royal Development Company that ran this mining camp. In 1928, he meets my mother, and they get married eventually, and they come to this place to live. In 1930, the Great Depression has not yet really presented itself. There's my mother with one or two of the cooks in the place. This is what it looks like today. It's a typical Western ghost town. Buildings falling down. There's where the snow crushed these 10,000-gallon oil tanks. Another abandoned dormitory building. Yet another building destroyed, equipment abandoned, stamping mill foundation. The whole mill has been destroyed by the snow. Oil tanks again. All right. So why is this a story of some importance to us? My father thought that the 1920s were boom time everywhere. He was going to go west to make his fortune. And he marries my mother, and as I say, in 1930. They go away on a little bit of a honeymoon. They come back, and at that camp, I don't think I have a picture of it here, but it was a building like that one. The company had built a 2-room annex on the side of the building for them to live in over the winter. The winters were severe. It was 2 days trip on snowshoes or skis to get out. There was no mechanized transport, huge snow, big avalanches, and so on. But my mother, grown up in a coal mining district in the Canadian Rockies, so living in severe winter conditions okay with her. So she decided that she just married my dad, and they wanted to live together. So the company built a 2-room annex on a building like this for them to live in. She was going to be the first woman ever to winter over in this camp because of its remoteness. All the miners who had wives, the wives left and went to Spokane or Seattle over the winter. That was the good news, that the company was accommodating them with this facility. The bad news was that just about 6 or 8 months later, the place went bankrupt. And it never actually produced copper for the market. It never realized a dime of revenue. And my father, his dream was shattered, his savings and his family's savings, his sisters and brothers who he encouraged to invest in it, what little they had, all was lost. And he went into some deep funk, nervous breakdown, and my mother told me later he shed a layer of skin like a molting snake because he was just so depressed. He'd let himself down, let his new bride down, blah, blah, blah. This is 1930. To the best of my knowledge, and the history is a little murky, but to the best of my knowledge, he did not have wage income for the next 6 years until he went to work as a clerk in the grocery store at the construction site for Grand Coulee Dam. And then he took a civil service exam and went to work for the General Services Administration in 1940 at the Bremerton Naval Shipyard in Puget Sound, and he remained a federal civil servant for the rest of his life. So it was World War II expansion of government that finally gave him a reliable paycheck, and finally they had me. Now, so I was born in 1941. If it had not been for the historical circumstances that affected my parents' lives, it's highly probable that, I understand the biology, it wouldn't have been me, but some near genetic equivalent probably would have been born about a decade earlier. Good Irish Catholic couple that they were, you know, they were expected to have a whole bunch of kids, but they waited 11 years because of the economic disruption that blighted their lives before they had the confidence to actually start a family. So had it not been for the Great Depression, I would not be here. Somebody else would be here, I suppose, but it wouldn't be me. So that's why I say I offer myself to you as a historical specimen, living and breathing right here in front of you, of how these great historical events actually can affect individual people and individual lives, including yours and the lives of your students. All right. Okay, I want to come back to this because it also has great historical significance. And this is my next to last data point for you here. Another great source, and again, in my experience, a source that's readable and accessible to students, including students at the level where you're teaching them, is this famous book published in the 1920s called Middletown by Robert and Helen Merrill Lind. And the Linds and their researchers went to Muncie, Indiana. That's the actual place that they studied, and spent, again, off the top of my head, I forget, but it was months and months, maybe 12 to 16 months, in this town trying to create an empirically responsible profile of what life was like in a statistically modal American mid-sized city. And they didn't use the word Muncie in the title, they called it Middletown, but we know it was Muncie. And they published this book in the late 1920s. You'll see it's a study in American culture is the subtitle, a very ambitious kind of a study. And it remains to this day a classic of sociology and of social characterization and description. The reason I want to call this to your attention, they talk about everything, as is recent social trends. They talk about religion, marriage, child rearing, education, transportation, employment, so on and so forth. But here's the important point to me, and I pass on to you. They struggled, the Linds struggled when they were writing this book to come up with a responsible definition of what they intuited and perceived as some kind of class stratification in Muncie or Middletown. And they had a very palpable sense that people sorted themselves into different classes, a term that then and now doesn't get used broadly or widely in American academic discourse, not the way it does in European discourse, for example, but they knew that there were class distinctions. So how are they going to fix them, or how could they describe them or quantify them even? And they decided it wasn't just wealth. That would be the kind of obvious thing. There are rich people and less rich or poor people. That would be one big class distinction that you might just intuitively think was there. But no, that was not what they came up with. What they came up with, and this is, I think, a really central finding to our understanding of this period, is that what they called, here's the names they gave to it, the business class and the working class. And what distinguished the business class from the working class was, in a single word, security. That the so-called business class had security of employment. So they could plan for the future. They could anticipate a phase of life called retirement. They could plan for their children's education. They could plan for family vacations. The so-called working class, which was the majority, some of them had quite good jobs, and some of them had incomes that might have even exceeded members of the so-called business class, but they were precarious. Indeed, now remember, this is the so-called booming 1920s. The average unemployment rate in the 1920s nationwide, including Muncie, Indiana, was 9% in any given year. Now, we would think 9% unemployment today would be pretty horrific. In fact, when we touched the 10 percentage point unemployment rate here, 2008, 2009, we thought we were in the midst of a national crisis. It averaged 9% of the 1920s. So even people who had good employment in one season or 1 year couldn't count on it for the next. So insecurity of employment, insecurity of income is a huge fact of life. And it distinguished these two different classes. So if we ask what's coming over the horizon here in the next decade or two in terms of changes in the workforce and changes in people's attitude toward or experience of the life cycle, it is what the New Deal puts in place. Some of you probably heard me say this before. The single greatest thing the New Deal does is it reduces risk and imparts more security to sector after sector after sector of American life. It makes home lending more secure. It makes bank depositing more secure. It makes unemployment less of a menace. It provides for some measure of security in old age. Security is the word that sums up everything that's coming institutionally, politically in the 1930s. So this is, it seems to me, an absolutely central finding about an aspect of American life that was common in the pre-New Deal, pre-Depression, pre-World War II era, and the Linds, I think, nailed it when they came up with this finding that what distinguished the business class from the working class was, as they said, security of employment. All right, one last observation. And it has to do, quite naturally, with what we're talking about in terms of government initiatives. So again, just to put this in a little bit of context, Herbert Hoover accepts the Republican presidential nomination in 1928. And it was common in that era. This is a kind of cosmetic political difference between then and now, but it was common in that era for presidential candidates not to attend their party's national conventions, but to be nominated in absentia and then some weeks or months later to give an acceptance speech and become their party standard bearer. So Herbert Hoover did not attend the Republican convention in 1928. He was nominated, and several weeks later, he graciously accepted the nomination in a speech at Stanford Stadium, because he's the only Stanford graduate to make it to the White House so far. And he had in attendance some 80,000 people there at Stanford Stadium in the summer of 1928 when he gave his acceptance speech. And he said in the course of that speech, I'm quoting him now, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." Well, we know he had to eat that without salt in the years to follow. But again, I'll talk more about this tomorrow, about how Hoover fancied himself upon taking office as the agent of the political agent who would resurrect and revitalize the old progressive tradition of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. He was overwhelmed by a crisis on a scale that neither of those prior presidents could have anticipated or understood, as he did not understand it. And to this day, the Great Depression remains a black swan. We've not had anything comparable since, not least of all because of some of the reforms that were put in place in the 1930s. But he misunderstood it. Nobody understood it as what we understood as the capital G, capital D Great Depression until well into the episode. Probably not until 1931 or 1932 did people begin to sense that this is a scale of a crisis on a monstrous scale, such as the likes of which we have never seen. So one of the things that Hoover had to deal with, even as he tried to find the levers of action that would give him some way to counterpunch against the Depression, was the size and scale of the federal government, which was simply a much smaller institution then than it was today. So this is, if you want to pay a little bit of close attention to this, this is total government spending. That is federal, state, local, special tax districts, all put together. 1929, the eve of the Great Depression, about 9% of GDP, the whole country's wealth in any given year or income in any given year, is spent by governments at all levels. 1936, it goes up a bit. It actually comes down a bit in 1940, but in our time, these data are 10 years old. They're essentially unchanged. Spending at all levels is about a third of GDP. Now, we hear a lot in our political discourse today about how big government runaway spending, blah, 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 is a big political problem. In all the OECD countries, that's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries, the two countries that spend the least of their GDP on government at all levels are Japan and the United States. All the countries that we typically compare ourselves with in the OECD spend in the 40 or even 50% range of GDP at all levels of government. So we remain stubbornly, to this day, a society that doesn't really like to invest too much power and resources in government, even though it's gone up tremendously relative to our own history back in the 1920s. Now, I'll just leave you with this last observation, and I'll be happy to take some questions or comments. But the fact is that in 1929, we see 9% of all government spending amounts to about 9% of GDP. 2/3 of that was state and local, and about 1/3 was federal. Today, we've reversed the ratio. About 2/3 of all government spending today is federal, and about 1/3 is state and local. So not only has government grown at all levels between then and now, but the ratio of federal to state and local spending has inverted, so that we now spend about twice as much at the federal level than we do at all the state level governments combined. So Calvin Coolidge once said, while he was president, so sometime before 1928, he said, if the federal government went out of business tomorrow, the average citizen wouldn't notice the difference for at least 6 months except for postal deliveries. And that was true, because the federal government didn't do much. Didn't have many responsibilities. Wasn't set up to do business on a national scale the way we think government today does and should. But that wasn't the case in the 1920s. So we'll get to this tomorrow, but among the challenges that Hoover had, and Roosevelt for that matter, was not only figuring out what was a ideologically, politically legitimate way to counterpunch the Depression, but how do you create the institutions on the spot that are adequate to the task? Something that was not a problem in 2008, 2009, when the lessons of the Great Depression and the institutional legacy of changes that had been affected in that period made the federal government much more capable of acting swiftly to counteract the great crisis of 2008, 2009, so that we did not see a development on the scale of the Great Depression of the 30s. All right, well, here you see it again here. It's the federal budget is a percent of GDP. And you again see 3% in 1929, and today, well over 20%. And I guess I'll leave you here with this awful image, which is usually used as kind of a summary statement of the catastrophe of the Great Depression. It's the Dow Jones Industrial Index, of course, 1920, 1940. I'm sorry this doesn't go further in time because, again, if we compare the Great Depression and the Great Recession, there really is no comparison. The Great Recession, we lost about 40% of stock market valuation, and within about 24 months, we were back to almost the full level pre-crisis. In the Great Depression in the 30s, we lost 90% of all equity valuation, and it took 25 years to get back to 1929 levels, not until 1954, even given all the boom of the war and so on and so forth. So to repeat, the Depression, what you're going to be studying the next few days and talking about was a crisis on a scale that mercifully we've not seen ever since. Okay, I'll stop there. I know I'm standing between you and dinner. Very dangerous position to be in.